Can I be found intentionally homeless because of the actions of a household member? Now, this is an interesting question. The technical term for this is acquiescence, and I'm going to try and explain a little bit about this now. But first thing to say is that there is no such thing as an intentionally homeless family. You can have intentionally homeless household members, but there is nothing stopping a wife, let's say, making a fresh application if the dad's been found intentionally homeless, just to kind of just give a quick example. In fact, if I talk about an example I worked with in Bedford a few years back, we had a mum, 3 kids. The oldest kid was over 18. Now, the mum had had a heart attack. She was in hospital for a couple of months, during which time housing benefit wrote to her. She obviously didn't respond, and her housing benefit was stopped. So before she knew it, she was in rent arrears and the landlord was evicting her. She went to Bedford Borough Council, and predictably, Bedford Borough Council said she was intentionally homeless, when actually, when you look at the records the council had themselves in terms of the rent statements and stuff from the landlord, it was clear that that was not the case. But I only found out about the case about 5 months after this had happened. So crucially, the mum had not challenged the intentional homeless decision within the 21-day time limit. So when I first met them, it was getting into autumn. They'd been homeless. And I was confronted by 2 options, really. One, I could try to go back and kind of reapproach the council and try to undo this intentional homeless decision, but they might have said that because it was out of time I couldn't do that. So what I did instead was I got the adult child, the adult son, to make an application in his name with the rest of the family on the household. And again, interestingly, you had 2 options there. Do I make an application and say that he's in priority need because of the mum's health issues? Or do I make the easier argument that he's in priority need because his siblings, his young siblings who are under 18, are actually dependent children who are dependent on him? And that's actually the argument I made in the end, because in the real world, because his mum was very unwell, he was the one driving around, doing the shopping, doing the cooking, getting them to school, that sort of thing. And so that's the way I went. And they were owed the main housing duty, and they were housed shortly afterwards. So it's kind of a good way around this intentional homeless decision. So judges have basically said that household members should not be held responsible for actions of their family members or whatever, where they were simply not aware of it, or they just weren't agreeing to it, they weren't colluding in it. And that kind of word collusion, I guess, is not too far off this word acquiescence. So in order to explain this, I'm going to go through a couple of cases. They're actually from a case law book. If you haven't got it already, if you're working in the sector, it's well worth getting. It's about 70 quid, the new edition, but there's older versions which you can get, which is still useful to some extent for much less money. And I think there's a new edition coming out later this year in 2024, which I'll certainly be getting, because the most recent case book actually goes before the Homelessness Reduction Act. So there's a whole world of case law which just isn't covered within it. But things like intentional homelessness haven't changed for about 40 years, so a lot of these cases that you see are actually from the 80s and 90s, and it's really interesting to read some of them just to see kind of how we see things differently now. There's one example where there was a couple, the guy had been, I think, gambling the money away or something. Basically the wife wasn't aware of it. They pulled into the housing options office, and the housing officer said, you haven't been paying the rent, at which point the wife got so angry that she knocked him off his chair, and that was used to show that she was not acquiescing in the actual non-payment of rent. So as I say, I'm not quite sure what you make of it these days, but that's what happened back then. And that kind of goes somewhere to show you need to have evidence that you have not acquiesced in the actions of your household member. And it's the only time within intentional homelessness decisions where the benefit of the doubt goes to the council rather than the applicant. Normally it goes to the applicant, but in this situation, effectively the position is that a council can expect that a household, a family, talks about things, works in cooperation with each other, and therefore ordinarily would be aware of these issues. Now I'll start with a case where there was a couple private renting, and the guy who was the tenant basically had had enough of the landlord not making repairs. So basically this guy told the landlord, I'm not going to pay rent until you do this work. And the landlord said, I'm going to evict you. So they're evicted. The guy was found intentionally homeless, and so the wife or the partner made an application in her name, which is possible. And again, that means that if nothing else, assuming they're in priority need, that they're going to get some more temporary accommodation. And then this kind of question of, did the wife know about the actions of the guy? And there was no evidence to say that she did, but the council were entitled to say, look, in this situation, in an ordinary household, you've got these disrepair issues. It's kind of very unlikely that you weren't talking about it regularly, because presumably it's an issue. And it's also very unlikely that the guy didn't tell the wife that he was not going to pay the rent until the landlord had done the work. And as I say, in the absence of evidence, that was taken to have, on the bounds of probabilities, that's what's happened. And so she was also found intentionally homeless. So that's kind of our starting point, really, in terms of how we look at this. But there's a couple of other cases I'm going to go through that kind of illustrate this, how this principle works elsewhere. And actually there's a couple of cases which on paper are very similar. So single mums, teenage boys, teenage kids, and in both cases the antisocial behaviour of the kids in the neighbourhood had resulted in both families being evicted. Now the first man makes a homeless application, and the council basically say that although she was not in any way part of the antisocial behaviour itself, because she'd taken no action whatsoever as far as they could see to stop the boys doing whatever it was they were doing, she was therefore acquiescing in that behaviour and was therefore found intentionally homeless. Now, as I say, these are old cases, and I think these days you might start looking a little bit more carefully into things like domestic abuse and kind of those sorts of dynamics, but as I say, this is the case law as it is at the moment. Whereas the other case, which was similar, in that case I think the police were involved, or antisocial behaviour team was involved, and they basically commended the mum for her attempts to control the behaviour of the boys. And that was enough to show that she was not acquiescing in their behaviour, and she was therefore not intentionally homeless. And so actually, weirdly, the council would have owed the whole family the full duty. So that's that case as well. And then finally, there's another case which I guess is sort of less clear cut. I think it's an Eastleigh case. I'll see if I can put the names of these cases up on the subtitles or whatever. But in that case, again, the guy was the tenant, and somewhere along the line, I don't quite know what had happened here, but he had solicitors involved in the situation, and his solicitor had basically given him formal advice that if he doesn't pay the rent, the council will have a duty to rehouse him, and that's very bad advice basically. I'm not sure if they're liable for it, but anyway, in that case, I think the wife had made that application after the guy was found intentionally homeless, and I think there was evidence that basically she had not been happy with the guy not paying the rent. You know, there had been arguments about it. She had kind of expressed that she was not happy with it and had tried to convince the guy to pay the rent, and she couldn't make him, and I think that was enough to show that she was not intentionally homeless. So as I say, this kind of came up in a live stream a few weeks ago. Really interesting case around kind of Proceeds of Crime Act, that sort of thing, and essentially whether a very historic crime could lead you know, a new partner to be found intentionally homeless. So yeah, do check out the live streams every Thursday night, 7:30. Any questions you put into the comments should get picked up within YouTube. And again, this case just illustrates how important it is to challenge intentional homeless decisions when you get them. You've only got 21 days from receiving that notification before the time runs out. And it doesn't really matter, you don't necessarily have to get a fully formed argument to send. As long as you send something saying, I don't think this decision is right, that gives you a bit more time to then kind of flesh out the arguments. Another thing that's just worth mentioning at this point is that if you're being accommodated under Section 188 or if you were in temporary accommodation, let's say, and they reach a negative decision, the council still has to continue housing you in temporary accommodation if you provide, you know, something that's new, some sort of new information that's more than trivial, and specifically, and I don't quite know why this is, but you have to ask to be housed pending the outcome of that review. So providing new information in itself does not trigger this duty for councils to continue to house you. You need to give them new information as part of that review request, and then ask for housing as well, and that should result in you being housed whilst that review takes place. So that's something to kind of bear in mind as well. We might talk about that elsewhere. Anyway, hopefully that helps. If you find this stuff useful, do subscribe. You'll get notifications about the weekly live stream. Do like it as well, do share it around, because this information can make a big difference. And as I say, the principle is that applicants should not be held responsible for the actions of their household unless they colluded with it, unless they acquiesce with it. So it's pretty reasonable, I'd say.